Welcome in, psychology students. Professor Zeeb here, and welcome to our introductory lecture on amnesia. So we're just going to go over the basic forms of amnesia. There are several, and kind of give you some straightforward facts about it. So let's sort of set the record straight here in the beginning that amnesia is not the same as normal forgetting. A lot of people kind of make this assumption. See, normal forgetting, some of the stuff we've talked about would include things like interference or lack of retrieval cues or even decay. As we talked about in earlier sections, amnesia really is anything but normal. Technically, amnesia is the loss or deterioration of long-term memory. In most cases, it is something known as declarative memory, a type of long-term memory, which is basically memory for factual knowledge and information that can be stated in words, and thus that's why we call it declarative. Even in our most severe cases of amnesia, and we've had some doozies, the person simply does not forget everything about themselves. So I think Hollywood really plays on this, where the person suddenly forgets everything. That is not the case. And if it was, we would consider that to be more of a neurological issue, such as dementia. So to kind of explain this one and how it's related to the brain specifically, we go to this really interesting case of HM. HM was this young gentleman by the name of Henry Malaya Sen, but we call him HM to hide his identity at that time, had a very severe case of epilepsy back in 1953. So it's important to know that this took place in 1953, and he was 27 at the time. Unfortunately, HM had a severe case of epilepsy where he was not responding to the medication of that time. And so what they did back then to help alleviate some of the symptoms of the seizures was that they would perform psychosurgery. In other words, they would go in surgery and remove different parts of the brain. So it turns out that doctors had removed most of his hippocampus. So you can see the structure here in red, structure which we know memories, now we know that memories are stored there. They went in and removed most of that section of his brain. Unfortunately, what they did not know is that this could lead to memory problems. In fact, HM got a massive case of what we call anterograde amnesia. So there are several types of amnesia. This is one of them. Anterograde amnesia is the inability to store new long-term memories. So in other words, for the most part, he would have trouble creating new long-term memories, but he still had his short-term. So I want you to think how this would completely change you as a person to not be able to form a new long-term memory. Remember, he was 27 in 1953, so if Henry Malaya Sen was still alive today, and we asked him, "How old are you?" he would say something like 27. In other words, after the accident, after the surgery, he could not remember all his subsequent birthdays and events that had passed. So it's almost like he's locked in time into thinking he's 27. Researchers noted that he would often read the same thing over and over again. He would also have trouble meeting new people because as soon as that person walked away from him after meeting them, he would forget who they are. So just think about how incredibly this would affect you as a person to not remember things, not be able to store things in your long-term memory. They also noticed that he could not fathom new technology and new words invented after 1953. So for example, if we asked him what the internet was, he would have no clue unless he was sitting in front of a computer using it. But as soon as he would walk away from the computer, that memory basically would be erased or not stored properly. So it's interesting that it would affect him personally, but also how he interacted with the world as well. Just a really, really interesting case. They also noticed that HM experienced a mild case of retrograde amnesia, our second one. And so basically what this means is loss of memory for events that occurred shortly before the brain damage. In other words, the person may have blackout periods in the time frame leading up to the damage or the accident or surgery in this particular case. For example, he may not remember driving to the hospital that morning before he had his surgery. So retro meaning before. In other words, it's damage to memory before the actual accident. So according to our records, it turns out that HM was very important. You know, it's a tragic story, unfortunately, but this discovery of how memory is related to this brain structure, the hippocampus, led to an explosion of research and emphasis on the hippocampus. So because of HM, unfortunately through that tragedy, we have discovered this whole forefront of research and knowledge based on memory and how it works in the brain. So basically it just means that sometimes there's a silver lining to tragedy. In this particular case, HM paved the way for future studies. Okay, so that will conclude our short lecture on amnesia. Please progress to the next step in the class.